In this video, you're going to learn how to draw a one-point perspective using my favorite app, Morpholio Trace. What's going on, everybody? My name is Carter and welcome back to Design It Green. Today we are going over the fundamentals of perspective. Now, learning how to draw perspective is a really important skill to learn to allow you to start creating freeform perspectives and to take your ideas into a three-dimensional space. So to get started on learning how to draw them, the first one to learn is the easiest one, which is the one-point perspective. And we call it a one-point perspective because it has one vanishing point. Now down the road, of course, you will learn about 2, 3, and multi-point perspectives, but in this case, we're going to start with the easiest one to pick up on. So go ahead and open up Morpholio Trace and open a new document. Now, one of the great features that Morpholio Trace has to offer is their perspective tool. This option lets us choose a 1, 2, or even a 3-point perspective and allows us to move around and pick our vanishing points anywhere in the app. So let's choose 1 point and let's pick a point. Now, after you pick a point, there's a couple of different settings that I like to toggle on and off that I find to be the most clean when working with perspective. For me, that's to only have the guide option selected on. And I do this because when I have the grid and the assist on, I think there's just kind of too much going on and it makes it a little bit hard to read when you're trying to kind of create these spaces in perspective. But of course, that's just my personal preference, so try them out and see which options work best for you. But essentially how the tool works is there's this little circle with all the different lines that lead towards the vanishing point, or they're horizontal and vertical. And basically you just move it around and you're able to snap to the points, and it makes it really, really easy to create perspectives really fast. Now, the last step before we get started is to kind of set up your drawing instruments palette. So I really just like to use 2 pencils, one at like 6 or 7 point, and then one at like 2 to 3 point, and then just an eraser, and that's really all you're gonna need for this video. And of course, if you want a more in-depth review of Morpholio Trace as a whole, feel free to check out a previous video I made explaining the different features and options that Morpholio Trace has to offer for landscape architects, and designers. But all things aside, we are ready to get started on our one-point perspective. So in perspective, we have 3 main lines. We have our horizontal lines, our vertical lines, and all of the other lines are going to go towards our vanishing point. And you might be wondering, what's the purpose of this vanishing point? And that's exactly where that third line comes into play. Those extra lines that go towards the vanishing point is actually what creates depth and three-dimensional space in our 2D drawing. As soon as you take something like a square or a box and you draw these lines that go towards the vanishing point and finish off with another horizontal and vertical, you now have this three-dimensional cube. So that's really the core fundamental of a one-point perspective. You only have to worry about all of your lines going to one vanishing point, connecting with a horizontal or a vertical. And that's basically it. So in this case, how I like to start off my one-point perspective drawings is by sectioning off certain spaces and trying to create an overall kind of theme and objective that I'm going for in the sketch. I'm drawing, very light lines here, and I'm just trying to kind of create some spaces in these kind of big objects that I'm making. So for my sketch, I'm thinking about this stream that comes down the center, and there's these 2 walking paths that kind of go down towards the stream, and it's kind of encapsulated by these kind of streetscape buildings on both sides. So you can see I'm just kind of roughing out some ideas and trying to figure out where things are going to end up in later down the road. This is where I start to play with different ideas, like playing with heights and if the stream gets wider or smaller and how many steps are coming down, and retaining walls and things like that. And it's also important in these perspectives to add some type of foreground element. So I think I'm going to do some type of bridge that connects the 2 sides, and there might be some seats and some people standing there looking over the railing. And just remember that this is your first layer in the process, so keep things light. Don't be afraid to kind of erase and move things around. That's what this first kind of rough cut layer is all about. But once you play around with this enough and have something that you generally like to work with, it's time to create a new layer and revise that first layer. The goal this time is to still keep a light hand on this new layer, but start making those boxes a little bit smaller and start to define the space a little bit more, as opposed to kind of these big ideas that you had on the page. You can see in this phase, I'm really starting to think about how that stream works, the retaining walls, varying the heights of the buildings, and and all of those kind of smaller detail level objects. And of course, this process is going to take a bit when you're first starting out, so don't be intimidated, don't be afraid to make mistakes. This is what these first kind of different design layers are all about, and just kind of get your juices flowing and ideas on the page. Especially when you're first starting out, it might be useful to do this step a few different times until you kind of arrive at something that you like. But once you're happy with it, it's time to start making this drawing a finished product. So let's add another layer and start to make your final line work adjustments. This is the time when you want to make all those lines clean, dark, and connect perfectly so that your perspective really stands out here. So take your time on this, because this is where your perspective is really going to shine and really makes all the sense when you have these nice, dark, clean lines. But now that your final line work is in, it's time to add the fine details to really make this thing feel alive. So for me, I like to do all of my details on a different layer. That way when I'm drawing them in, I can erase some of the lines in the background that would no longer really be there with how the details are looking in the perspective now. So some of the details I really like to add to kind of make this feel a little bit more alive is to add people, vegetation, rocks, furniture, and rough out some buildings, especially if they're in the background. If they're in the foreground, I'll do a little bit more work on them, but if they're kind of background elements, I'll just do some rough textures to them. So as a landscape architect, I like to start with vegetation, and I like using Morpholio stencils for this. For the most part, I'll either use David Drazel's stencils, or I'll use my own custom stencils that I've made over my time on this app. You need to make sure when you're doing these detail things that you always start in the front or the foreground and work your way back, so that way your lines kind of make sense and everything's fading back to the background. So I usually layer up from grasses to shrubs to larger shrubs or small trees, and to my big focal trees after that. And a nice little pro tip when you're using these stencils is to rotate them, flip them horizontally, make them smaller or bigger. That way it doesn't look super repetitive and you're able to kind of make it look a little bit more natural. After that, I'll go ahead and add more details to the water, add some rocks in, some textures on the retaining walls and the buildings. What this is really doing is it's adding some touche to the drawing, and it's really making it kind of feel a little bit more realistic and seem like a habitable place. Now, this stage of the drawing and all these details is of course when your personal preference will come in the most, and feel free to add as much or as little detail depending on your style that you're going for or your style as a designer. And the last thing I'll do is I'll add some people into this drawing, some seating, and a little bit of score lines to kind of add a little bit more depth to it. Once the details are done, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to go on the outside of your drawing edges and draw a really kind of thicker line around there. What this does is it puts a little bit of emphasis on what's important in your drawing, and it allows you to kind of separate the line weights a bit, which helps with the overall depth and realistic element of the sketch. But that's essentially it. That's the 1-point perspective in a nutshell, and that's essentially what your drawing will look something like. Now, obviously, the 1-point perspective is a bit limited, and it's gonna be the least natural drawing that you can draw perspective-wise. But it's absolutely essential to learn, because once you learn the 1-point, you can draw a 2, 3, or a multi-point perspective using these basic tips. But I'm pretty content with the result, and the drawing is super quick to do, especially with Morpholio trace. This took me like 45 minutes to draw. But that's how to draw a 1-point perspective. So I hope that I was able to help some of you guys out there who are wanting to learn how to draw perspective for architecture, design, or just in general, and also how Morpholio trace can be used in this situation to really speed it up and make it really enjoyable, fun, and easy to use. And if you found this information useful, drop a like and comment below on what topic in sketching you would like to see next. And of course, if you are an architect or landscape architect or interested in the field, feel free to check out my other content that covers all those subjects as well. But that's all from me today. So take care, be safe, and I'll see you next time.